The desert did not breathe. It held its air the way a man does when he waits for the first shot, the sand lying perfectly still around the black shapes of tanks and guns, tucked into shallow scoops, cut by shovels in the dark. Watch straps clicked softly as men checked the minute, then checked it again. On a ridge behind the British lines, a torch flashed once, then twice, then was gone. It was October 23, 1942, and the line at El Alamein, between a few miles of Egyptian sand and the long route to the Nile and the Suez, was about to erupt. The Eighth Army crouched in its jump-off trenches, faces powdered gray by dust, mouths dry with the taste of cordite that had not yet arrived. At 9:40 p.m., the horizon ahead turned white as nearly 1,000 guns spoke at once. The concussion rolled like a physical thing, rattling canteens and the bones behind men's ears, and shells began walking west across the enemy line in a measured beat that had been rehearsed for weeks. They called the opening Operation Lightfoot because infantry would go first, picking their way through the minefields so the tanks could follow. There was nothing light about it. In front of the British and Commonwealth divisions lay the Devil's Gardens, belts of mines and wire seeded across the flat with the care of a farmer who expects a harvest. Sappers unfurled white tape to mark lanes under the jumpy wash of flares, their mine detectors ticking and going silent, ticking and going silent. An Australian platoon leader lifted his boot, moved it 3 inches, and felt time stretch as he set it down again. Somewhere ahead, German machine guns heated from their first bursts, and then cooled as they paused to reload. In those breaks, the men edged forward, breathing as if each inhale might hook a trigger. The Axis line, a mix of Rommel's Afrika Korps and Italian formations, had been bracing for this night, but the Desert Fox was not present to greet it. Laid up in Germany with illness, Erwin Rommel had left General Georg Stumme to hold the hinge of North Africa. Within hours of the barrage, Stumme collapsed from a heart attack while trying to re-establish contact along a front raked by artillery, and for a moment the defense felt leaderless. Even so, the ground itself fought for the Axis. The 88mm guns, dug low and masked, reached out through the smoke and picked off British tanks as they nosed into cleared lanes. Bodies fell into shallow holes and vanished beneath drifting sand. A New Zealand sergeant counted 7 steps at a time, 7 steps forward, kneel, 7 more, and lost the thread when a mine lifted a friend in a fountain of dust that seemed to hang forever. By dawn, the battle had firmed into a grind. Montgomery's plan was not a sweep, but a pressure test, the kind of slow turn that pries open a door by warping the frame. He struck on a broad front, probing, then pushing harder where the line bent. Each day began with the thud and scream of shells, and ended with the strange hush that falls when hundreds of men stop shouting at once because there is no one left to shout at. The sun and dust combined to make a light that flattened everything. Wrecked tanks lay at angles that fooled the eye into seeing them as dunes. Ambulances bounced along tracks so rutted that morphine barely had time to find a vein before the next jolt. In the middle distance, mirage made the desert look like a shallow sea where nothing floated upright for long. Rommel returned on October 25th, drawn back to a front that was already cracking. He took a quick measure: ammunition short, fuel shorter, the coastal road west already feeling like an exit someone might jam shut. He tried to counterpunch, shifting what reserves he had to the places where the British thrusts looked least certain. A battalion might be held, a ridge retaken, but each success cost fuel that could not be replaced, and crews he could not cycle to the rear. He radioed Berlin for permission to step back and regroup. The answer, rigid and absolute, came in a word: hold. The fighting thickened in the northern sector, where the ground, broken slightly by low ridges and wadis, offered just enough concealment to make advances possible and just enough visibility to make them costly. South Africans crawled forward at night over soil that squeaked under their elbows. Indian troops, faces wrapped against the dust, learned the exact weight at which a man could lean on a coil of wire without its barbs biting through. A flash overhead would make for a brief day in which every contour sharpened, then darkness would crash back down. The smell of hot oil and cooked paint clung to everything. A Scottish piper in a support trench played a few bars for the company holding there, his fingers sticking to the chanter, then fell silent when a mortar round walked close. Lightfoot did its work by inches and left both sides bled. Montgomery, who had promised his men no miracles, shifted to the next phase. He called it supercharge because the first had not blown the enemy's fuses. The fresh blow would fall into the same northern shoulder near Tel El Akakir, where the line had been thinned by days of wrestling. The 9th Armored Brigade drew the short lot, drive straight into the heart of the defense at first light on November 2nd, and tear a hole through it that other formations could widen. The tank crews knew what waited. 88s dug low, their muzzles set to scythe flat along the desert floor. They chalked names on armor plates and stowed letters where a friend could find them. When the barrage lifted, engines revved and the brigade moved out, tracks biting into a crust of sand that broke under weight. The slaughter was immediate. Tanks lurched, halted, and burned. Crews bailed out into air so hot with shards that it felt like a skin of metal. But every dozen yards gained forced gunners to swing their sights and recalibrate, and every wrecked tank served as a new angle of cover for the one coming behind it. The desert became a geometry problem solved with fire. Somewhere behind that killing field, the British infantry listened to the rhythm of 80s and knew the moment when the beat faltered. They rose and ran into the gap, rifles low, bayonets up, the old work of closing distance done in a blizzard of dust. Rommel stood on the deck of a command vehicle with binoculars pressed so hard they left red moons around his eyes and watched pieces of his defense go soft. Trucks that should have rolled fell quiet for lack of fuel. Counterattacks launched with bravery and ended for want of ammunition. He sent another request to withdraw and received another refusal that did not account for the arithmetic of what was left. Staff officers marked positions on maps that had been smudged by the heel of a hand dragging too often across the same square. The dream of a renewed lunge east, the old long hook that had brought the Afrika Korps to glory, died without ceremony in the middle of a morning. On November 4th, the line finally broke. British armor surged through, and with it, the certainty that the Axis could no longer hold Egypt. Prisoners came in knots, hands up, faces gray with exhaustion and powder. An Italian gun crew, out of shells, stood by their weapon and waited as if a last order might still arrive to justify their time there. In Cairo, bells rang for the first time since the war began. In London, Churchill found the phrase that would travel: before Alamein, never a victory. After Alamein, never a defeat. On the ground, the men who had done the work could only feel the quiet, heavy mood that follows any great exertion. They topped ridges and saw the road west unspooling in a long ribbon of dust from retreating columns, and they knew what came next: the chase. The pursuit carried the 8th Army through the western desert into Libya, the road littered with jettisoned cans, abandoned spares, and notes chalked on tailgates by drivers telling the next unit where water might still be found. The desert, now the color of victory in a dozen newspapers, treated everyone the same. Engines overheated, eyes stung, and thirst lived on the back of the tongue like a coin. Each night, the line of advance paused, rethreaded its supply, and moved again. For many in the ranks, the campaign had narrowed to a personal ledger: the living and the lost, the tank that still answered to its driver's touch, the one that had burned with a friend inside and kept burning after the friend had been pulled free. El Alamein did not end the war in North Africa. It made that end inevitable. The Allies had demonstrated that Rommel could be checked and pushed, then made to run. Torch landings would come to the west, pressure would converge, and the Afrika Korps would finally be crushed in Tunisia the next spring. But those were moves on a larger board. The men who had cleared mines by touch and counted steps under flares remembered different details. A boot print, filled with the first light of morning, a hand on a radiator that had just cooled enough to pat, a letter in a breast pocket that carried through everything and tainted every silence. On the field itself, the wind started its long work the moment the guns fell quiet. Sand drifted against the flanks of tanks and over the black streaks where smoke had curled. The wrecks settled, as if relieved to stop pretending they could move. Graves were cut shallowly, marked with crosses, stars of David, and plain sticks, rows that would be visited for years, and then less often, as people who had known the names became names themselves. The maps went into archives. The guns were pulled back to depots or shipped to new fronts. But the straight line cut across that desert, the hinge that would not swing toward the Nile, remained in the minds of the men who had held it, a place where the night began with a signal and the earth rose under their knees when the barrage started, and where, for the first time in a long time, the momentum of the war felt like it turned their way. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.